Hello, welcome to week 3 of the Storybook Test Bootcamp. I'm Kyle, and I'm going to be walking you through this week's material, which is all about testing in CI. So, you've hopefully by this point used Storybook Test within your Storybook, and that's great as you're developing to run those tests and get your status updates as you're working. But to really have total confidence in your UI work, you really want that to be in your CI or continuous integration environment. And that's what allows you to run your test after you submit a pull request, for example. So let's walk through that. So I've just published this testing in CI document, which I will share shortly. And then, so it's really pretty simple. There's just a few steps. And one of these is actually should be done for you. So when you installed the test add-on, it should have added this script into your package JSON. And that just allows like an easy standard way to run this vtest command and filter down to your Storybook project. And then all we need to do is just call that command inside of the CI environment. And so we've added instructions here to do that in a number of environments. I'm just going to do the GitHub Actions one. And so the way that works is in your project root, you make a .github folder, and then a workflow directory, and then a file, a YAML file. In this case, we'll call it test UI. And then GitHub workflows have kind of like a shape to them. And so you give it a name, you tell it like on what events should it run on. And then here, let's get into some unique details of this workflow. So first off, we're giving it a Docker container image to run on. And you'll note that that's a Playwright one. And that's because Storybook Test opens up a headless browser and uses Playwright to run that browser. And so if we use the Playwright Docker image, we don't have to install that as a dependency later, which can be slower. And so this image is just a quick way to get the environment that we need. Then we set up Node just like we would always do, install our dependencies, and then run our tests by calling that npm run test storybook that we put in our package JSON. And like that's basically it. After that, anytime you push to, in this case, GitHub, it's going to run this workflow. And so I kind of wanted to show you an example of what that looked like in a real project. And so I've got this this repository SB demo where I'm just kind of, it's a basic storybook with some components, and I did some recent commits to add Storybook tests to the CI. So this is literally copy pasted from the document there. So that's my workflow file. And then I had an older version of the test add-on, so I did have to add that script manually. So there's that in my package JSON. And then, let's see here. Okay, and then that then shows up on pull requests as a status check. In this case, it's a failing test, or if it's successful, it'll have a green check mark. But before I go into that, I want to show you one more detail. So Storybook Test, when a test fails, will give you a link to the failing story. And when you're doing local development, that just uses your locally running Storybook. But when you're doing CI, you need to tell Storybook Test where that published Storybook is, and you need to publish your Storybook in the first place. And so that's what this section here is about. We're debugging test failures in CI. And so what you could do is you build and deploy your Storybook using a service like Vercel or GitHub Pages or something like that. And then that uses this kind of GitHub standard where it fires a deployment status event that your workflow can listen to. And so to convert that previous workflow to one that will have a better debugging experience, what you do is instead of happening on the push event, it happens on the deployment status event. And then you add a condition to your job so it only runs if that status state is successful. And that just makes sure that this will only run when there's a successful deployment. And then finally, that deployment status has a URL associated with it. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to set an environment variable equal to that deployment status URL. So called SB URL. And then what we can do is we can use that environment variable inside of our vtest configuration. So where we call this Storybook test plugin, it takes some options. And so we're going to add this Storybook URL option and set it equal to that process.environment SB URL. And the end result of that is, in this case, I'm going to show you a Vercel example. And so Vercel deployed my Storybook. It gave me a deploy preview on my PR. Once that finished, it then kicked off this workflow and it knew this URL. And so it passed it to that environment, which means when the test ran, it had access to this option. And so when a test fails, it can give me a working link to the failing story. So let me show you what I mean by that, because that was kind of abstract. So first off, here's what it looked like to make those changes. So, So like I said, you change the event on which the job runs, and then give it a condition to make sure it only happens when it's successful, and then pass this environment variable SB URL, which is equal to that URL there. And then I missed a step in that config or in that commit, so I had to do a separate one where I passed this Storybook URL option into my Storybook test plugin and set it equal to that environment variable that I am now passing in my workflow. And so I have a PR here that just kind of fakes a test failure so you can see what that looks like in a real workflow. And so the way this worked is these checks ran first, and once the Vercel one was done deploying my Storybook, it kicked off my UI test one. You can see that it's a failure. So let me click into that. Now, if we didn't have Storybook to debug, I'd be stuck looking through all of this supposedly helpful debugging information, trying to figure out what went wrong in my test. And that's a lot, and a lot, and a lot. Instead, I can click to debug the error directly in Storybook, and you'll see that this URL now is a Vercel deploy preview URL. And so if I open that, here's my deployed Storybook for that PR. It opened to the right story, to the component test tab because it was a component test failure. And I could see immediately what was wrong here. And I have the real component here, and it's a web browser, so I can right click and inspect. I can do anything I need to do. And so that's, let's just make sure that's it. Oh, no, one more detail. So in a few weeks, we're going to be discussing code coverage in a lot of detail. But just so you know, you can definitely calculate code coverage in CI as well. We recommend updating the test Storybook package.json script to just have this coverage flag here. Or if you only want to do it in CI, then you can update whatever you're doing in CI to use the coverage flag as well. Just wanted to include these instructions here for completeness. And like I said, we'll talk about code coverage a lot in the coming weeks. And then if you wanted to, if you have other vtest type tests, so like unit tests, for example, for things that vtest also runs, you kind of have two options here. You can either have a separate script that filters down to just that different project and then run them independently. Or what most people will probably do is you just have one test script that just runs vtest without any filtering at all. And then it'll run every workspace project that you have, probably in parallel. And so then your CI workflow, instead of being test storybook, would just be test. So yeah, that's how you run storybook tests in your CI, and that will give you the best confidence as you're working that your UI is functional and doing what it needs to do. See you next week.